This is where we're at now. If you're a refugee, we treat you this way, we treat you fairly, we do this for you. But if you're Irish, you just wait there. Can you just go over there and stand there until we get to you? And that, I think, is a real sad state of affairs for people whose families built this country. You know, they lived on spuds and bacon. They were lucky if they had bacon, but they did so to leave an inheritance to their children, to leave something of value. And now that's been squandered by the politicians and by the banks in Europe who have no interest in cultural heritage. They don't care about your customs and traditions.
So welcome back, everybody. I am here with world-renowned artist Kevin Sharkey, and it's very good to speak to you today, Kevin.
How are you doing? Nice to meet you again.
So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the kind of immigration debate that's happening in Ireland at the moment. But before we get into that, you were born in 1961 and you grew up in an era of Ireland's history that has a very bad reputation today, I think you'll agree, because we're told that 1960s Ireland was a very bigoted and small-minded and a fundamentally backwards place. So for those of us who weren't alive then and who didn't live through that period of history, what was that Ireland like in your experience?
Well, I mean, I was born in a mother and baby's home on the Navan Road, and, you know, people understand a lot more now about what that experience must have been like. Some people still don't particularly want to know. They want to sort of like airbrush it. And in 1961, you know, illegitimate children were quite a mistake. It was, you know, it was one of those things that the communities and the parents, they just did their best to hide it, to make it go away. And sometimes the girls would go off to America or off to London, and it was always hidden. It was something to be ashamed of. Having a black child in those days is almost like really poking the fire, because it's a double whammy almost. One of the letters that the nuns who arranged my adoption, when they wrote to my adoptive parents, one of the things they said in the letter was, apart from the colour problem, we don't see there being any other problems. So they already were able to transfer onto me, a 6-month-old baby, racial issues which I knew nothing about, and which where I went to in Donegal, there were no black people. I mean, I didn't see a black person until I was 13. So my experience of Ireland in those days was one in which I was a curiosity. And it was a bit like E.T. turning up, you know. Suddenly there was this little black fella, and their reaction to the little black fella was, by and large, mostly in my experience, it was warm, it was inquisitive, it was welcoming, it was innocent, but sometimes it would bring out the devil in people, you know, and they couldn't, the Irish, they like a good laugh and a joke. So if you were the crux of a joke, it wasn't often to your face, it was more behind your back, but it was never malicious. I don't ever remember, apart from one old lady who used to give me a banana every time I went to her house. And she used to give my friends biscuits, and when I said to her one day, why can't I have a banana like everybody else? She said, well, I thought you would prefer a banana. Now, as an adult, I know now she was taking the piss big time and probably went to the pub and said, oh, I gave him a banana. But as a kid, you were kind of like, well, can't you just treat me the same as everybody else? So there was that undercurrent, but it was never really an issue. And I think maybe because I was the only black child, there was no sense of blacks taking over. There was no sense of there goes the neighborhood. And in the time that was in it, you really looked around you, and that was the social setting. Was like, you know, in rural Ireland back in those days, you know, people weren't very wealthy. Killybegs was a fishing port, so you were either going to be a farmer or a fisherman. But by and large, I mean, obviously I had struggles within my adopted family and throughout my childhood. That was probably the least safest place for me, was at home, really, because the community kind of embraced me as, I won't say a mascot, but certainly everybody knew who I was, and that gave me a sense of belonging. It gives me a sense of, you know, of something I think adopted children need, which is the feeling that they fit in. Because it's hard to put a black kid in a white environment, and so I had to work on that. I had to work on my own sense of displacement, and that Killybegs and Donegal and Irish culture was what I embraced. You know, I had 37 medals for Irish dancing by the time I was 11. So I had no other culture. That was all I knew. So to understand as I got older that people didn't see that when they looked at me was very like, okay, well, what do they see? And what they saw was a culture which I had no experience of, a culture I had no knowledge of. But here I was, it was on my shoulders. And I was responsible. My behavior could be interpreted as being positive or negative on black people when I didn't know any black people.
Many years ago, there was an interview with Phil Lynott, who was obviously a very prominent black celebrity at a time when there weren't very many of those knocking about in Ireland. And he was talking about his experience of growing up in Dublin, and he was asked by the interviewer something to the effect of, did you ever get racial comments or racist comments directed at you because of the color of your skin? And he said, well, no, I mean, people would make comments about the color of my skin, but it wasn't racist. And the interviewer said, well, how is that possible? And he said, well, they'd make a comment about my skin, but then they'd go to the guy next to me and they'd make a comment about his ears, or they'd go to the guy next to him and they'd say something about his weight or whatever. And he said it was just sort of Irish people making fun of whatever is the most prominent feature about you. If you're tall, you're lanky. If you're short, you're shorty, etc. And so he never saw any harm in it. Do you think there's a bit of that was in old Ireland, that it might look a lot worse at face value, but then when you drill down into it, it's a little bit more benign?
It's called humor. It's called distinctive humor. For example, if you look at the world of football, you know, people talk all the time. I get asked about these football players, these black football players who have a banana thrown onto the pitch. And to give it some perspective, they're men playing a man's game. And men can be incredibly mean and descriptive and insulting to other men. It's how they banter, it's how they make fun, it's how they have humor. But any aspect, just like you said, that is different about you will be picked up on. So, you know, David Beckham gets chants about his wife, you know, and all sorts of, you know, they'll slag anything about you that's different. And I think that the people who think that football will ever become this place where there is no chanting and they're tripping. They're not looking at the world as it is. This woke idea that, you know, where I grew up, for example, comedy was always rude. It was always insulting. In fact, the more insulting it was, the funnier it was, whether it was Basil Fawlty, whether it was Frankie Boyle. These people used offense as humor, and it was funny. Now, it's been shifted away from, oh, you can't say that, and you can't say this. But I think when I look at some of those football players, say, oh, he threw a banana onto the pitch, and I'm saying, guys, you're getting 200 grand a match. Throw the banana back, eat the banana. But really, don't look for a safe space within the world of male football, because it doesn't exist. And in a way, I don't think it should. The whole point of camaraderie is piss-taking. And like you said, if you know, my friends when I was a kid, I got called Sambo occasionally, but so my friend who had red hair was Ginger Nuts. My friend with glasses was Four Eyes. And to me, it wasn't any different. It was a descriptive term. I didn't find it offensive, and I never heard the N-word as a child growing up. And I still, today, have a real problem with people who provide platforms that allow that word not just to be used, but promoted. And the young people who write music, and it's, you know, people talk to me about racism, and I say, wait, you know, today, the most racism that I see in Ireland is towards Irish people. If you're Irish in Ireland today, you are seen in a particular way. And I think that this notion that only white people can be racist is just, it's nonsense. You know, I was shocked when I got to the UK to realize that black people can be just as racist as, I was really surprised because I thought, come on guys, after all you've been through. But then I discovered as I traveled the world, the Chinese don't like the Japanese, the Germans don't like the Italians. And we used to think of tribalism is wanting your country to be the best country, wanting your team to win. That's what made us feel a part of something. But tribalism has now been declassified and it's suddenly become racism. So to be proud of your country, to be proud of your culture, you got to be very careful now you don't offend people. So it's difficult for someone of my age, where I grew up in a time where Ireland was something you were proud of. You sang the national anthem at the end of every dance. You were told that it was important to be Irish. You were told that there was nobility, if you like, in being proud of your country. But that has now become, since the European Union, which by the way was sold on trade, and now it's become something completely different between armies and immigration, you really begin to understand that the narrative has shifted to one in which those thoughts and those feelings can be seen as offensive to somebody else. And that's when a lot of people, I think now, they just self-censor themselves, you know.
Speaking of self-censorship when it comes to these issues, obviously one of the things that's on the agenda now in Ireland and in many European countries is hate speech laws, and the idea that if somebody makes a gratuitously offensive statement about somebody's race or their religion or even their gender or whatever it might be, should carry a criminal penalty, that we shouldn't tolerate that legally as a society. Do you think that these hate speech laws are necessary, or that they could do some good in curbing some of the worst elements of human nature?
What's interesting to hear you say that, because, you know, that's something that I would have always argued was important, to be able to express yourself. And then who gets to decide what is hate speech? And who gets to decide how much somebody is offended? You know, I look at people who say things like, you can only be Irish if you're white. And I'm like, whoa, whoa. Where does that leave me? Where does that leave you? Where does that leave Phil Lynott? And I think that kind of hatred disguised as patriotism is very, very dangerous, because stupid people say, oh, well, so if you're not white, you're not Irish. That can only lead to separatism. And I get very worried about people who use religion as a way to hate. They use religion as a way to sow intolerance. And I think that if you're a believer in God, you have to accept the fact that to second guess his creations is a little bit rude. So whether it's the seagulls you don't like, or whether it's the darkies you don't like, or whether it's the gays you don't like, you have to say, well, you can't believe in God and believe that you know better than he. So there's a reason. If you believe in God, there's a reason for everything. And when I see people who use this, then that's when I really feel strongly that some people abuse free speech. And that makes me sad. But should she be not allowed to speak? I don't think that solves anything. I just think you compartmentalize things so people feel, I can't say that here, but I can say it at home. I can't say it in the pub, but I can say it at work. And I think it doesn't make the problem go away. It just puts it under the radar.
What would you say to somebody who accused you of hypocrisy because of the fact that you wouldn't be here alive today if it wasn't for immigration? Because this is a question that I get sometimes when I'm discussing the issue of immigration, because my mother is an immigrant from Jamaica, and so people say that if you're wanting to restrict immigration or change Ireland's immigration policy to be more selective, then it's almost like you're pulling the ladder up behind you, and that there's something contradictory about that. What would you say to that?
Well, the first thing I would say about that is, if our government were making the immigration policies, I would have a particular answer for that question. But as Leo Varadkar said only weeks ago, that we cannot put a cap on the amount of Ukrainians coming to this country because the decision is not ours, the decision is made in Brussels. That tells me that we don't have a government. What we have is a group of compromised people who will do what they're told by unelected officials in Brussels. So this whole repopulation of Europe, which is underway, you know, it all rides on one single thing, and for me it's really important, is, do you believe that democracy is real? Do you believe that it's fair and that it's just and that it's transparent? And my answer would be no, I don't. I've seen too much evidence of political parties moving from, now we shove these guys in till you get fed up with them. Then they're fed up with them, we shove the other guys in till you're fed up with them. Then you can have the other guys back. And I don't believe, personally, I think the big lie that people are being sold is the idea that their vote matters and that it's counted. And I think there's lots of questions to be answered in relation to whether we are being given honest democracy. Because if we were, we could affect change. But the truth is, what I see is not change, I see musical chairs. So you have people who are purporting to be in government to look after people, to make people, to give people a better life. But what I see is not that. What I see is a lot of vested interest looking after the elite, looking after the 1%, and looking after their friends and tax. You know, if you're caught fiddling the dole, you're going to get sentenced. You're going to get a prison fine. You're going to get fined. If you're a white-collar worker and you're up to all sorts, that's not going to happen. So we have this system in place which is very, very much about them and their cronies. And I just doubt that the electoral process is as transparent as it should be and as honest as it should be. Even looking at the states and the election with Trump and Biden, you know, there was a lot of weird stuff went on that night. I remember specifically watching it. Now, Was that an honest result? I don't think it matters to the powers that be anymore. All that matters is to change the face on the milk carton. Because Trump was a great distraction. Hillary Clinton was a great distraction. Joe Biden is a great distraction. But these people, the amount of power they have, in my opinion, is very limited. The decisions are made almost before they get there. So the whole idea that democracy changes anything, unfortunately, I wish it did. But what I see now is we have decisions being made in Brussels that tell us how many people. Now, in relation to me and my father was a Nigerian medical student. My mother was Irish. As we were saying earlier, no one sees the Irish mother when they look at me. They see a culture which I know nothing about, which I have no influence of. So for me, growing up in Ireland, I had the most amazing experience growing up in Ireland. And my thoughts about the future of Ireland are based on wanting people like me, like you, who have either even one Irish parent or no Irish parents, to have a similar experience. But the more this broad spectrum opens up, I can see the problems arising, because what you have is a lot of young, disenfranchised young men who were brought here by their parents, they want a better life for them, but they don't feel a connection to Ireland. They don't feel represented when they look at the television. You put on the Late Late Show, you pick up a newspaper, you don't see black faces. You see the token one now, but the problem is if you have, this whole thing about diversity, I couldn't give a shit about diversity. I think it's nice to see kids having what I never had, which is kids from different backgrounds as friends. And that, I love the idea of, what's the word for it, when people integrate. But what I see now, to me, seems to be people trafficking. I'm seeing these groups of young Afghanistan men, these groups of men who are coming to Ireland, and they're basically being invited by the government. You know, they got here without passports. No, they didn't. They were allowed because they'd been invited. If you go to places like what's happening in East Wall at the moment, what you have is basically a lot of bewildered men inside that building who are going, we were invited here. We were told we're going to get medical cards, we're going to get a job, we're going to get a flat. So they didn't get here by accident. But what the problem is with the government today is that they're not being honest with the Irish people and saying, these are the new workers. These are the low-paid workers. These are the people who are going to do the jobs that your lazy fat ass doesn't want to do anymore. But we need them because we need the workers. But they don't. And they just spread it across the board and say, they're all immigrants, they're all refugees. And say, whoa. Are you sure about that? But the problem is they don't seem to have the balls to say to the Irish people, look, we're bringing these people in because we need those jobs to be filled. But instead, they paint everybody with a refugee status, which feeds right into the Irish guilty conscience of, Jesus, you have to help them, God help them, God help them. And that's the problem for me for many years with Ireland, is the Irish people are very gentle, soft, caring, compassionate people, but that is abused. Every week you see how that compassion is being abused, and they're being forced to go with, well, you can't say anything about it. So what you have, in my opinion, is you have people trafficking. That's what the government is engaged in right now. And those men who are coming from wherever they're coming from, they're sitting in these places and they're thinking, well, why are these people outside chanting? We were invited here. We were allowed in. So the people who are outside chanting really would probably be better off outside Leo Varadkar's office or Mary Lou McDonald's office, because if you believe in democracy, then these are the people who are making the decisions, so they need to be held accountable.
Well, it's interesting you bring up Mary Lou McDonald, because you were talking about change earlier, and as you know, change is kind of the mantra of Sinn Féin. That's the platform that they're running on, is just change, 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 and that's sort of the wave that they've ridden to get to where they are in the polls at the minute, where it's looking at least possible that maybe one day they could be in government. And you were a member of Sinn Féin briefly in the early 2010s, I believe, and you said you split with them, and I think your words were you felt like a poster boy. What did you mean by that, and what's your view of where Sinn Féin is going now?
Well, I think, that change is an easy thing to say, and in politics, it's all about what people say. So change, 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 transformation. We listen to people who trot out that mantra again and again and again without substance, without what kind of change. It's so easy to sit on the sidelines criticizing everybody else who's doing a shit job until you have to step up. And in my opinion, there is no gap between the government parties. I hear people talking about the Green Party and these new parties. And I think, yeah, but ultimately, the major parties they're all in alignment when it comes to immigration. My issue with immigration is really simple. I never said we shouldn't have immigration. Of course we should. You know, it would be ridiculous. But when I see models of immigration that work, then I think, well, that's the kind of immigration we should have. But as you know, you only have to say the word immigration and go, oh, you want to send them all back to Africa. And that's not something that I've ever said, but that's the risk you take when you move off the government policy, is that you're somehow an extremist just because you're questioning their actions. And that for me is when you're getting into very dangerous territory, because once you start saying that concerned parents that live in Dublin who want to protest about 400 strangers coming to their area, you know, it's interesting that Rodrigo Gorman and who's the other minister he doesn't have kids. There's two of them that are constantly out there talking about how this is a good thing, diversity, how we need cultural enrichment, but these guys don't have kids and they certainly don't have girls. Now, if I had girls, I would feel very differently about my surrounding environment because, you know, young girls are vulnerable, and they're vulnerable sometimes to cultures that have a different take on how young girls should be treated. So you have a situation now where people who are genuinely concerned about what's happening in their environment and in their communities are being called, you're racist for caring, you're racist for wanting to know who these people are. How the hell are you going to control who's coming to your country? You wouldn't let somebody into your house without knowing who they were. So we're being asked to just trust these politicians, and in my opinion, they've tarnished that trust in a huge way, because this is where we're at now. If you're a refugee, we treat you this way, we treat you fairly, we do this for you. But if you're Irish, you just wait there, can you just go over there and stand there until we get to you? And that, I think, is a real sad state of affairs for people whose families built this country. You know, they lived on spuds and bacon. They're lucky if they had bacon, but they did so to leave an inheritance to their children, to leave something of value. And now that's been squandered by the politicians and by the banks in Europe who have no interest in cultural heritage. They don't care about your customs and traditions.
You're obviously an artist, and one of the things that we associate with artists is creativity. And in order to be creative, you obviously have to be able to think outside the box and consider alternative perspectives on life and so on. And yet it seems like so many people in the arts tend to be more liberal, and paradoxically, obviously liberal means free, but it seems less and less like liberals believe in freedom of thought and freedom of expression, at least in the 21st century. And so it seems like some of the most stifling places around today are the arts. How do you manage to continue to be outspoken and have alternative views on things that go against the grain while staying in good standing within the art world?
Well, you know, that's an interesting one, because I think, I mean, I threw out my television about 25 years ago, literally threw it out the window one day when I realized what a poisonous piece of crap it was and how dangerous it was to be bringing that kind of negativity into my existence every day and paying for the pleasure. So I threw it out, and I started to look at the world through my own eyes rather than have somebody tell me what to see and what was happening. And in doing that, I became very aware that original thought is one of the few things we're gifted with, which is so exceptional, imagination. So for me, I make paintings, I make artworks, but I also make political statements through my work. And sometimes you are aware that you know, you cannot, like I would have, a guy bought paintings of me recently, and his friend said, oh, that guy's anti-vax. And the other guy went, I don't care. So he loved the artwork, he was looking at the work, but he was able to put my personal life aside. Yes, there are some people who would say, oh, no, I don't agree with what he thinks, but when you're talking about art, you're talking about beauty. And people have, you know, for many hundreds of years, people have been able to put aside the personality and look at the beauty, whether it's in Mozart, whether it's, doesn't matter, you know, Picasso, look at Picasso, he looked like a grumpy little bugger. He always looked like he had a bad temper, but it was his work which transcended him out from his personality. And I think with a lot of smart people, they don't look for an echo chamber in their artists. They look for beautiful art. They look for someone who can give them something of pleasure, something that they can enjoy, something that makes them feel enriched. So I think smart people have always been able to say, well, yeah, he might be a bit of an alcoholic, but look at the paintings. You know, he might have been cruel to his wife, but listen, the poetry. You know, and I think that's one thing artists have always been able to do, is to to be as true to themselves as they can be, but also to continue to bring beauty into the world.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Sharkey. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.